الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Continuing where we had left off last week with the first of people to enter into Islam. We mentioned the first woman to enter into Islam was Khadija. The first man, free man, to enter into Islam was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. The first of the youth was Ali ibn Abi Talib. The first of the slaves was Zayd ibn Haritha radiyallahu anhum. Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah mentions as well the first of the Jews and Christians to enter into Islam. He says, وَأَسْلَمَ وَرَقَةُ بْنُ نَوْفَلٍ وَفِي جَامِعِ التِّرْمِذِي أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رآه في المنام في هيئة حسنة. He said, and also Waraqa radiyallahu anhu accepted Islam. Who is Waraqa? Waraqa ibn Nawfal is Khadija's cousin. If we recall back to the first incident of revelation, when Jibreel alayhi salam first came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the cave in Ghar Hira. If we'll recall, when he came back to Khadija and he explained to her what had happened, what had occurred, she took him to Waraqa ibn Nawfal. And the reason she took him to Waraqa is that Waraqa radiyallahu anhu was literate. He was literate, and that was very unusual at the time. Likewise, Waraqa was very knowledgeable about the scriptures of Musa alayhi salam. It's even mentioned that he spoke, or he was fluent in Hebrew and was able to translate parts of the Torah into Arabic and as well translate things from Arabic into Hebrew. And in another narration, he was also, other narrations also articulate that he was likewise fluent in Aramaic, Suryaniyya. And so, Waraqa had become Christian in his time because that's what he found to be the closest thing to the guidance of Allah of the time. And when the Prophet ﷺ had that first encounter with Jibreel, Waraqa was the first to point out to him that this is Jibreel. This is the man, this is the angel, the archangel Jibreel who comes with revelation to prophets. And this is similar to the revelation of Musa alayhi salam. And so Waraqa immediately accepted Islam. There's not any clear narration in the history books to say that Waraqa necessarily said, I accept Islam or Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah in that way. However, there are narrations in which the Prophet ﷺ tells us that Waraqa is in paradise. There is, in the narration of Aisha, Waraqa passed away very, very soon after that first revelation to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ commented on Waraqa, as was collected by Imam al-Tirmidhi. He said that he saw Waraqa in a vision, and he saw Waraqa in a good state of being, which is basically articulating that he was in paradise. There are other more explicit narrations, though they have some weakness in their chains, that Waraqa radiyallahu anhu is in paradise. And for this reason, when you look into books of some of the scholars that recorded all of the names of the known companions, like Al-Isaba fi Tamyiz al-Sahaba for Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, or also Usdul Ghaba, and others, you find that Waraqa is usually mentioned as one of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We take a moment here to explain what exactly a companion is. A companion, a sahabi. What makes a person a sahabi, a companion? The scholars have a very specific set of criteria that they have picked up on that a person must meet in order to be considered a companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the legislative sense. A companion, and this ta'rif is very well known. Ibn Hajar rahimahullah used this definition of a companion, and he's most commonly known for this definition and this exact wording, though he did earlier take it from others like Al-Mizzi and Al-Maqdisi and so forth, and that is, a companion is من لقي الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم. Thank you. من لقي الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم مؤمنا به ومات على ذلك. They say a companion is one who met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in that meeting he believed in him, or met him a number of times. But when a person is considered a companion, they have to have been in the presence of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam physically and in a state of Islam, in a state of belief. And then they die upon Islam. This is the criteria. So 3 things. They have to have met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they have to have met him while they were Muslim, at least once, even if just for a moment. And then they die as a Muslim. These are the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the most broad sense, right? This is an important set of criteria because there are people who believed in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam but never met him. Those are not considered to be companions. They're almost companions. They're considered to be mukhadrameen in the science of hadith. And their narrations are usually just as acceptable as the narrations of the companions radiyallahu anhum, but they don't have the level of companionship, right? There are those who met the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam but did not believe in him when they met him. But they later became Muslim after his death, and they never met him again. Such as Suraqa ibn Malik, for instance. Suraqa ibn Malik was a bounty hunter who sought to get the reward of a contract, of a bounty on the Prophet ﷺ when he went out to, when he was migrating from Mecca to Medina. He was intercepted by Suraqa ibn Malik. As is in Sahih al-Bukhari, he attempted to capture the Prophet ﷺ. He attempted to kill him. He was unsuccessful. And the Prophet ﷺ said to him, "Do you believe?" And he said, "No. However, I promise you, I will never fight against you or help a people who fight against you." So he let him go. Suraqa ibn Malik never met the Prophet ﷺ again as a Muslim. He became Muslim in the time of Umar radiyallahu anhu. So he is not considered to be a companion. He's considered to be a mukhadram, which is the highest rank of the tabi'een. And so Waraqa ibn Nawfal is considered to be, by this definition, a companion. He met the Prophet ﷺ, believing in him, and died upon that faith. And so Waraqa ibn Nawfal is considered to be a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah says, وَدَخَلَ النَّاسُ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ وَاحِدًا بَعْدَ وَاحِدٍ. People then began to enter into Islam one at a time, and there was a steady, consistent flow of people entering into Islam during this stage of the da'wah. وقريش لا تنكر ذلك حتى بادأهم بعيب دينهم وسب آلهتهم فحينئذ شمروا له ولأصحابه عن ساق العداوة. He says, all the while people are becoming Muslim, and Quraysh is not really bothered by this. The disbelievers of Quraysh, they didn't really have a big problem with this. Yeah, they would kind of poke fun of him and they belittled him, but they didn't have any serious pushback against his da'wah until he started to speak ill of the religion of their forefathers, until he started to dismiss their gods and their deities. This is when Quraysh became hostile towards the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that is that when we say he insulted their deities or their religion, we're not speaking about being vulgar towards them. We're speaking about, he would say, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, Manat, these different gods that are worshipped by Quraysh and revered. These are not gods, these are idols. It is not permissible to worship these aside from Allah. We do not fear these things. These are not gods. That is considered to be an insult. They took this as an insult. And when the Prophet ﷺ began to speak out against their religion and some of their evil and deviant ways and innovations that they introduced to the religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam, this is when Quraysh turned very hostile towards him and his companions. فحمى الله رسوله بأبي طالب لأنه كان شريفا معظما فيهم وكان من حكمة أحكم الحاكمين بقاؤه على دين قومه لما في ذلك من المصالح التي تبدو لمن تأملها. He said, and when this hostility came about from Quraysh, Abu Talib stepped in and protected the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He protected him because Abu Talib was considered to be of high stature with and high esteem amongst Quraysh. He was considered of the nobility of Quraysh. And so he protected the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam the best that he could. And Ibn Al-Qayyim points to an issue here, and he says, and it is of Allah's wisdom that Abu Talib did not accept Islam. Abu Talib never accepted Islam. He died upon disbelief. And it's of Allah's wisdom that he did not accept Islam, because it really changed the dynamic of how he was able to protect the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He himself would have most likely fallen victim to the same hostility and persecution had he accepted Islam. But being that he remained upon the religion of Quraysh, but he said, look, not from a religious perspective, but from a tribal perspective, it is unacceptable for you to lay hands on my nephew. This made the dynamic of his protection to be very, very different and very effective. He says, وَأَمَّا أَصْحَابُهُ فَمَنْ كَانَتْ لَهُ عَشِيرَ تَحْمِيهِ امْتَنَعَ بِهِمْ وَسَائِرُهُمْ تَصَدَّوْا لَهُ بِالْعَذَابِ. And as for the rest of his companions, whoever was a member of a strong tribe and was able to seek their protection and the refuge in his or her tribe, did so. Some of the companions, they had strong tribes, they were able to do that. However, others of the companions did not have strong tribes. They were not considered of the nobility or notables, or they were slaves, or they were people that didn't have any family in Mecca. They're from some other land, and they moved to Mecca because it was more metropolitan. And so Mecca was considered to be more cosmopolitan. It was more integrated. People moved there that weren't from there in order to trade because of the huge influx of travelers due to Hajj. So people that accepted Islam and they didn't have a tribe to protect them, they were turned on by Quraysh, and they began to endure extreme persecution by Quraysh. Of these people was Ammar ibn Yasir, radiyallahu anhu, and his mother specifically, and also the rest of his close family members. They were persecuted and physically tormented almost on a daily basis. He says, وَكَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ إِذَا مَرَّ بِهِمْ وَهُمْ يُعَذَّبُونَ يَقُولُ صَبْرًا يَا آلَ يَاسِرٍ فَإِنَّ مَوْعِدَكُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. And the Prophet ﷺ was unable to stop this. It was beyond his power to make this situation any different. And the only thing that could be done was to be patient. And so when he would see them being persecuted, see them being tormented, he would consistently remind them and say, be patient, for indeed your promise is paradise. Paradise is for you. You just have to be a little bit patient. Of these individuals that were tormented physically as well was Bilal, radiyallahu anhu. Bilal ibn Rabah. He was of the most severely tormented from amongst the companions, radiyallahu anhum. He was not Arab, and he was a slave, and he was tormented day in, day out, and it was almost like a sport for them. If you read the narrations, if you read the books that comment on Bilal radiyallahu anhu and what he endured with his tormentors, you see that it was kind of a sport for them, right? They would torment him to try to get him to say certain things, and he would refuse to do so in order to frustrate them, because that's the only thing that he could do. And they would try to break him. And so they kind of made it their prerogative, their mission, to try to break this man and break his faith and break his mind. And they were ultimately unable to do this. Ibn Al-Qayyim says, وَكَانَ كُلَّمَا اشْتَدَّ بِهِ الْعَذَابِ يَقُولُ أَحَدٌ أَحَدٌ فيمر به ورقة بن نوفل فيقول إي والله يا بلال أحد أحد أما والله لئن قتلتموه لأتخذنه حنانا. He says that Bilal kind of had a mantra for himself that would serve to keep him firm and as well serve to frustrate his opponents, and that he would say Ahadun Ahad, meaning Allah is one, only He is worthy of worship. And Waraqa radiyallahu anhu would see this and comment to him and say, by Allah, yes, O Bilal, Ahadun Ahad, I concur. ولما اشتد أذاهم على المؤمنين وفتن منهم من فتن أذن الله سبحانه لهم في الهجرة الأولى إلى أرض الحبشة وكان أول من هاجر إليها عثمان ومعه زوجته رقية بنت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وكانوا 12 رجلا وأربع نسوة خرجوا متسللين سرا فوفق الله لهم ساعة وصولهم إلى الساحل سفينتين فحملوهم وكان مخرجهم في رجب من السنة 5 من المبعث. So as this persecution began to heat up, as things began to get more intense, worse for the companions, radiallahu anhum, some of them began to become weak, and some of them apostated from Islam, some of them left Islam, some of them were killed. Different things started to happen. And as this torment continued, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed those who were able to flee Mecca and able to migrate elsewhere, He allowed them to do so. So a person might say, well, I don't understand. What's the big deal about leaving? I mean, if you think about it, you're there in Mecca, you're being tormented. Why not just move outside of the city, move somewhere else and just be over there, right? It's not like that, because the way that Mecca was, the way that the tribes were set up, right? It was literally like countries. So if Quraysh has a problem with someone, and they have certain treaties with other tribes, no matter where you go in the entirety of the Arab Peninsula, you're not going to find anyone to sell you food. You're not going to find anyone to sell you land. You're not going to find anyone to allow you to live in a certain place. It's kind of like how countries are. You have a passport, and a passport is basically you saying that, look, I come from this country, I'm a citizen there, and this passport is to essentially say to whatever country you go to, I expect the best of what your treaty has to offer with my people. That's what a passport is, right? Well, if you could imagine a passport that, a person that is a fugitive and they try to leave with their passport, wherever they land, whatever country they go to, most likely they're not going to let them stay there. And they're going to consider them a fugitive. They'll either take them back or they won't allow them into the country. This is the same kind of thing. It's not just that a person could, get up, gather his stuff, and leave. It wasn't that easy. There is a lot of tribalism, there's a lot of treaties, there's a lot of agreements between the tribes. And if you're on bad terms with tribesmen here, and they have an agreement with tribesmen over here, you're going to be in a bad situation in both. And this did eventually happen to where they were cut off from, fiscally. It was basically a financial embargo that took place, as we'll get to, inshallah. And so, hijrah was allowed for people who were able to escape, to completely leave outside of the reach of that tribalism, right? Because if you imagine with me, there's a lot of tribalism, but it's not necessarily a country, it's not an empire. The empires were the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ethiopian Empire, right? These were really the empires that were around. And so that tribalism that was taking place in the Arab Peninsula, they weren't independently countries or empires. They were always just a part of the Roman or the Persian Empire. And so when they were able to leave and escape the reach of that tribalism, the closest place that they could flee to was Ethiopia at that time, Al-Habasha. And so this is where they fled. But between the Arab Peninsula and Ethiopia, there's water. So what they did was they fled at night, very few, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had it timed just so that when they reached that water, there were a couple of merchants there that were docked or getting ready to sail across. And so they took them with them in their ships. And by that grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they were able to escape, though they were being pursued. The first of those to make that hijrah was Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu anhu, the third Khalifa and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's son-in-law. He had the Prophet's daughter with him, Ruqayyah, radiyallahu anha, and there were 12 men and 4 women. So we have just around 20 people that made that first migration, that first hijrah, right? And they made that hijrah to Ethiopia, to Al-Habasha. He says that this took place in the 5th year after the Prophet ﷺ's prophethood, in the month of Rajab. So in the month of Rajab, Rajab is the 7th month of the Islamic lunar calendar. This month, the 5th year after he was appointed as a messenger, as a prophet, in the month of Rajab, this is when this first migration took place. He says, وَخَرَجَتْ قُرَيْشْ فِي آثَارِهِمْ حَتَّى جَاءُوا سَاحِلَ الْبَحْرِ فَلَمْ يُدْرِكُوهُمْ ثم بلغهم أن قريشا قد كفوا عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فرجعوا فلما كانوا دون مكة بساعة بلغهم أنهم أشد ما كانوا عداوة فدخل من دخل منهم بجوار وفي تلك المرة دخل ابن مسعود فسلم على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو في الصلاة فلم يرد عليه هذا هو الصواب كذا قال ابن إسحاق قال فلما بلغهم أن ذلك باطل لم يدخل أحد منهم إلا بجوار أو مستخفيا وكان ممن قدم منهم فأقام بها حتى هاجر إلى المدينة فشهد بدرا وأحدا يعني ابن مسعود فذكر منهم ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه. So they escaped to Ethiopia, to Al-Habasha. They were able to cross the water. And they remained there for a while. Now, of course, they kept their ear to the ground with regards to anything that was happening or transpiring there back in Mecca with the Prophet ﷺ. And they were trying to stay abreast with any new developments there. One of those developments is that a rumor started to spread that all of Quraysh accepted Islam. And this was not true, obviously, but this was the rumor, and this was what was making the rounds. And so those companions that made that first migration were, of course, very thrilled, and they wanted to go back and be reunited with their tribesmen and with the Prophet ﷺ, and so they returned to Mecca. But what happened is, as they came close to Mecca, just little ways on the outskirts of Mecca, they found out that actually, not only is that untrue, but Mecca has upped the ante, Quraysh has upped the ante against the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, and they have become more murderous and vicious than they ever were previously. So this now is a conundrum, is a problem. Do we go back into Mecca and become a part of that, or do we go back to where we came from? What should we do? And some of the historians, some of the Islamic historians mention that the reason why that rumor spread was that the chapter An-Najm was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. In this chapter An-Najm, at the very end, at the last verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there is what's referred to as a sajda. And in that sajda, the Prophet ﷺ went to a gathering of the nobility of Quraysh, and he recited this chapter to them, Surah An-Najm. And they were so captivated by it, they were so enthralled by Surah An-Najm, that they forgot to abuse the Prophet ﷺ. They just wanted to listen to it. They didn't interrupt him and they didn't abuse him. And at the very end of this chapter, the Prophet ﷺ made sujood. Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu and also Ibn Abbas, they mention in Bukhari and Muslim that when he made that sujood, no one present refrained from making sujood with him. So everyone, Muslim and kafir, Muslim and non-Muslim, antagonist or protagonist, all made sujood with the Prophet ﷺ due to the immensity and the gravity of Surah An-Najm. And so when they saw all of these people making sujood, Abu Jahl is making sujood, and Iflan, it appeared to those around that they had accepted Islam. And so a rumor started to spread and make the rounds that all of Quraysh had accepted Islam. They're all now Muslim. All of Mecca is Muslim. And we saw them all praying together. Obviously, this is not the case. And so they headed back to Mecca based on this faulty intel. And when they reached the outskirts of Mecca, the truth, the hard truth, sank in, and they realized the hard truth. So whoever wanted to enter Mecca, they either entered secretly or basically smuggled themselves into Mecca, or they had to wait on the outskirts of Mecca and seek sanctuary from different tribesmen that they may know. And so the way that this works is that, let's say my father was a friend of your father's, and you have such and such tribe. And so I say, look, our fathers were friends, please grant me protection. And so I would come in under your protection, the protection of you and your tribes, right? You and your tribe. And this, nobody is going to really interfere with that person because of the politics that would be involved with that. And so there were those who were able to enter back into Mecca in this way, and then there were others who were unable to enter back into Mecca in this way and were forced to instead basically smuggle themselves back into Mecca. He mentions that one of these individuals was Ibn Mas'ud radiyallahu anhu. Ibn Mas'ud is from Mecca originally, and he made the first hijrah. And then he came back and he entered into Mecca during this time. And he stayed there with the Prophet ﷺ until he made the second hijrah, which was the major hijrah to Medina with the Prophet ﷺ. This is what many historians mention. Of them is Ibn Ishaq, rahimahullah. Ibn Ishaq is the author of As-Sirah An-Nabawiyya, and it's summarized by Ibn Hisham. So it's one of the most important sources of the Prophet ﷺ's biography. Ibn Ishaq has his book As-Sirah. This book is lost. We don't have this book anymore. This was lost many hundreds of years ago. The only remnants of the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq that we have is what's known as Sirat Ibn Hisham. And I'm sure we all know the Sirah of Ibn Hisham. It's considered the most expansive, most well-known book on Sirah. This book, Sirat Ibn Hisham, he summarized it from the book of Ibn Ishaq. So the original work of Ibn Ishaq is mafqud. We don't have this book anymore. The only thing that we have is its summary, which is by Ibn Hisham. So the only narrations that we have from Ibn Ishaq is what was delivered to us from Ibn Hisham, rahimahumullah. This book, had it remained, is a very expansive book, and that's the book that has all of the chains of narration in it and so forth. Unfortunately, it's been lost, and now all we have is Sirat Ibn Hisham. And this happens in the history of Islamic scholarship. There are some books that have become lost. We read about them. We read about these books in the works of later scholars, but when we go to look for the book, it doesn't exist anymore. We don't have it anymore. And so the only thing that we have of that book is whatever the scholars who used it and had it at the time narrate to us in their books. There's a lot of books like this. A good example of this is the Musnad of Baqi ibn Makhlad, rahimahullah. Baqi ibn Makhlad has a very long story, a very intricate and inspiring story in which he traveled all the way from North Africa to Baghdad on foot. And he was a contemporary of Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah. And on his journey from North Africa to Baghdad, he stopped at every major village, every major city, and collected narrations from all of the scholars in his path. So he had the most expansive collection on narrations of the Prophet ﷺ ever in the history of Islam. Also, he had the biggest tafsir in the history of Islam. And he met Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal and so on and so forth. The point is that this book, the Musnad of Baqi ibn Makhlad, is lost. We don't have this book anymore. We have scholars such as Al-Dhahabi. Al-Dhahabi is a scholar of the 7th century, right? So Al-Dhahabi, alim min al-Qarn al-Sabi'. Al-Dhahabi mentions in his book Siyar A'lam al-Nubala that he saw volumes of this in his life, right? Ibn Hajar is a 9th century scholar, and he mentioned in Fath al-Bari that he had seen a few volumes of this book yet. Somewhere between that time until now, that book has been lost. How do these books become lost, you ask? Because these books become lost due to war. The Crusades had a huge impact on the Islamic library. Unlike the Muslims and their scholars, when Muslims would usually enter into a land, the most important thing was the books. They would take them, they would translate them, they would read them, they would study them, they would preserve them. The Crusades did the opposite, and also the invasion of the Tatar invasion, which was the Mongols. They as well came, and they had no use for knowledge. They were not a people of knowledge. They were not literate. Most of them were very lay and illiterate. And so the first thing they would do when they would come into these big Muslim cities, big Muslim areas like Baghdad, like Asham and so forth, is they would take all the books and burn them, or they would take all the books and throw them into the river, right? They came into Egypt and threw them in the Nile. They came into Baghdad and they burned them. And so some books, that was the only copy. Some books, there was only 4 or 5 copies, and that's all of them, right? And if there's only, if you can imagine a book that they have to literally, there were no printing presses. If you want a copy of the book, you have to write the whole thing. And so if you imagine Baqi ibn Makhlad has a book that is 40 or 50 volumes, how many copies are there going to be? 3, 4? Well, all of these will be easily wiped out in these kinds of crusades and these invasions. So unfortunately, there are some books that have been lost, but alhamdulillah, the bulk of Islamic knowledge has been preserved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's favor and grace. That's enough for tonight. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.